Afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining our deep dive webinar on the technical approach behind our Te Kanapu future grid work. With me today, I have Andrew Sykes, Technical Director of our Future Grid program, and also Trudy Shannon from our communications team. And we hope to run an interactive session with you where we are here to answer your questions, particularly around the more technical aspects of the work we're doing, building on the publication in December of the overall approach to our technical analysis, and also the earlier documents that we put out as part of our Te Kanapu journey. Just to recap where we are, in the space of 18 months, we're hoping to be able to come up with a grid blueprint that will help inform us and all of you by taking a longer term view of the role the grid plays as an enabler in our economy, of what investments Transpower might need to do in the longer term so that we can be ready for them, as opposed to how things work today. Work sort of reasonably well, but in a more incremental approach. So July last year, we went out and we sought everyone's views on how the economy could grow, knowing that growth is really important to our country if we are to lift our GDP and have a better future for everyone. And also knowing that our stuff takes a long time to build. That came together in the potential scenarios, the 5 scenarios that we put out in October 2025. And we'll be shortly publishing our feedback on those scenarios. We will make some changes. So look out for that as part of the future director consultation number 4 on that list. And as I say, the focus of today's discussion, but not only the only focus, is the technical approach document, which we published in December 2025 and had initial webinar on, I think, on the 11th of December. We're now into the technical analysis phase and on track, albeit with a lot to do on publishing the draft grid blueprint. We hope end of September, maybe early October, but as soon as we can. And that will be out for consultation, and we will publish the final first grid blueprint. It won't be our last in November, December. Mindful that that grid blueprint is about telling us what we need to do, and we'll be looking at the low regrets projects that come out of it. It won't necessarily be defining a build program to 2050 that we are going to do irrespective. Anyway, at that point, I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who can give you a little bit of a highlight of what was at the core of the technical approach document that we put out in December 2025. So while he's talking, have a think about questions that you've got for us that we can address as part of an interactive Q&A shortly. And we will carry on talking through the slides we've got here, but at some point we'll turn the slideshow off so you'll be able to see us and be part of the conversation.
Okay. Thanks, John. Yeah, so that the process diagram up on the slides at the moment gives it sort of a helicopter view of our technical approach to developing this future grid blueprint. So yeah, as John said, in late last year we published really a suite of documents that covered our technical analysis and our approach. These covered our approach to demand forecasting, the generation stack, the transmission options, and the methodology document itself, telling us how we sort of blend all those inputs together to get to the grid blueprint. We held a webinar about that in December last year, and that webinar was really a whirlwind tour, I guess, of each one of those documents, recognizing that those documents hadn't been out for very long. So not a lot of people had the opportunity to read them. now we're sort of hoping that that's had a little bit more time to sort of percolate those documents, and we've had some sort of questions and common themes of discussion topics that have come up in our engagement and through that consultation. So we're keen today to sort of answer some of those or discuss some of those bigger questions that people have that have been coming through on that document, and also to bring in some new questions. You know, if you've got questions, send them through. So I'll hand over to Trudy now to sort of take us through.
Sure, thank you, Andrew. So what would you like to know? There's a question and answer chat as part of this meeting. Please add your questions to that and send them through, and we'll get through them in the rest of the session. We thought we'd just start with some questions that have come up during our engagement, some kind of common questions that people have. Yeah, so my first question, tell me, how is transmission planning changing? What's driving the change?
Sure, yeah. So but Te Kanapu, that our sort of new approach to transmission planning is shifting things from kind of a 10-year horizon that's looking at how we can look at incremental reinforcement to the existing grid, to building out into a sort of 30-year horizon to look more at sort of what sort of anticipatory new build is likely to come. So this new approach kind of integrates some power system modeling, market modeling, and cost benefit analysis across a range of possible future demand and generation scenarios to identify sort of a least regret set of investments. It's quite a change from the way that we've our sort of traditional transmission planning approach, and these changes are really critical, and now's the right time to initiate this because we're in a period of rapid change, you know, driven by electrification. There's greater uncertainty. John mentioned the need to grow the economy. There's rising expectations around what the energy sector has to deliver for New Zealand. So having a transmission planning approach that evolves and is fit for purpose in the sort of modern economy is what that's all about.
Oh, thank you. It sounds like a really bold undertaking. It sounds really hard. Don't you need a crystal ball to be able to look that far into the future?
Yes, yeah, yeah, that would be great. But that's, you know, so in the absence of that, what we need is people to support us on this journey, right? So we can't understand what the future is on our own. So we really look and rely heavily on stakeholder engagement for that. We use engagement and consultations in forums like these to sort of refine our views and form views on what's happening in the future. We also don't pin our hopes and dreams all on one scenario. You know, we look at multiple scenarios and consider a variety of different possibilities and the way that they may play out. So really kind of uncertainty around that future is something that it's sort of a feature that we have to embrace. We can't pretend that we know what will happen in the future.
I know that other parts of the industry have their own modelling, their own forecasts. Are those things we're also looking at?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we're trying to kind of, we want to build on those and use those within to help develop the blueprint. That's right. Yeah. So using those to the extent that it's appropriate, using those industry forecasts is really important to us.
And Trudy, our forecasts are ambitious, and that's quite deliberate. We really want to scope out the space of how the power system might need to grow so that we are aware of the investments we might need to make. Right? Better that we understand what we might have to do and plan for it, because transmission, just takes time to build. And if out of this work, even though, there are other options about a more decentralised system or whatever, we still end up saying, on a least regrets basis, we need to build new transmission lines. That's really challenging for us. We've been successful with tactical upgrades to the grid. We're currently building new substations to enable electrification. But the one thing that is sort of on my mind is the sheer lead time and challenge, if we have to, of building a long new transmission line. So hence, if people look at our scenarios and say, well, that's bolder than some of the other ones in the industry, it's because we really want to understand what the opportunity might have to be, so we're ready for it. If we don't grow as fast, if these things don't happen, we can slow down. But if we're not prepared, then the risk is New Zealand goes through a more expensive pathway to growth and decarbonisation than if we were an enabler.
Sure. So that's if we do need a big transmission grid. What would you say to people who, perhaps have a different view, that everyone will have a solar panel and a battery on their house and we won't need the grid in the future?
I think, for us, we're open-minded as what the future looks like. So I'll be very clear. If, as part of our modelling, and when you look at our generation mix, you'll see these decentralised and distributed resources in there. If we show that is a least cost pathway, that's great. But from work that Andrew has done and some papers we may release, even in a very decentralised world, networks have huge value in allowing the sharing of resources, right? So at times when you've got a lot of solar in one region, the ability for that to help another region is great. At times when you've got lots of wind, so even with way people are using batteries, so that even in that world where the grid might not be, and distribution networks might not be bulk electricity transfer over time, that connectedness is important. And we can see a little bit of that happening in Australia, that some of the more recent work done over there seems to indicate their core grid is all about service energy intensive industries. They have a huge amount of rooftop solar and now subsidised batteries, but then distribution networks now are still important as the mesh that allows resources to be shared. When you look at the scenarios we will build to supply the 5 potential demand scenarios, they will have mixes of centralised and decentralised resources in them. There are futures where decentralised resources can play a much stronger role, perhaps more of a services economy. If we're growing GDP in New Zealand by investing heavily in industrial production and fuels and data centres, there's probably a stronger case for more centralised generation as well as decentralised. So we really want to, we're not saying it can't all be done with solar and batteries, but we want to explore that pace, and we think we've set our scenarios and our approach up to test it.
That sounds good. No questions yet through from the group, so just a reminder that you can click on that Q&A button in Teams to send through your questions if you have some. Moving on to some more questions. This is one for you, Andrew. You're looking at the power system modelling, the market modelling, the energy trilemma considerations, and that kind of donut picture you had.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about that and how they work together.
Yeah, sure. So so essentially that's our kind of process for analysing the benefits or the costs associated with new transmission. And the way that works, so power system modelling, that's basically simulating the physics of the electricity grid. You can't ignore physics, right? It's pretty important. So that's absolutely crucial. That's, how does the electricity grid work and how does the power system as a whole work? So keeping an eye on that lens is crucial. Market modelling, that's basically simulating the economics and the money flows in the system. That's also very important, right? So having those two lenses on how is the electricity system going to work now and crucially in the future in these kind of fantastic scenarios that we've got, those two lenses, physics and economics, are crucial. The energy trilemma, that's basically like the perennial problem in energy sector, right? That's balancing reliability or security, affordability, and sustainability. So that's the dream, is every country or every economy or everywhere, they want to balance those three things. And so the way that we kind of iterate through that physics and economics and sort of understand whether we've got the kind of right balance in there is by a sort of assessing it against that energy trilemma. And that's our sort of way of determining whether or not the grid blueprint that we're proposing, this sort of final grid blueprint that we're proposing, is going to deliver, is designed to deliver an energy sector that works, for everyone.
Sure, and as you develop hypotheses, you then go back and test them again against those, you go around that circle again.
That's right. Yeah, hopefully not too many times, but yes, yeah, absolutely. You have to, it is iterative.
Cool. So the question and answer button apparently isn't working for everybody, but the chat definitely is. So please pop questions in there. So we've got one here from Philip. Just 1 second. Which we'll get to in just a moment.
I can see Philip's question.
You read that now?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, here we go. How are you thinking about maybe binary type risks? For example, whether or not a large data center or maybe a generation plant turns up or it doesn't.
Yeah, great question. And actually, it's a great question and it's timely because so the way that to sort of answer the question first, or to describe our approach is the way that we deal with that is we use it within our scenarios and with sensitivities to our scenarios. So because we're the nature of the new grid that we're talking about are these large backbone type pieces of grid, and they're sort of large we have a sort of a threshold where we sort of say, okay, yes, that's a sensitivity or a binary kind of thing, but it's not sort of sufficiently large that we are worried about it. But there are still big binary risks, like offshore wind is one that springs to mind. Like that pumped hydro project that used to be on the agenda was another one that was large and binary. And then one that's recent times is the LNG type of announcement as well. And I think it's important to keep these things in the mix, even if you don't want to get tunnel vision here and think because it's not falling out the other end of an electricity market model that it's off the tables and it's never going to happen. Like LNG is a good example of that. Like it wasn't the case that we were just sort of seeing LNG as being this thing that had to happen and was just going to fall naturally out of an electricity market model, but it did happen. So the learning there for us and for people in the sector is that things are going to happen. Things are going to happen within the sector that aren't just things that are going to fall out of an electricity market model. So you've got to treat them. You've got to keep if they're material to your planning processes, which some of them are and some of them aren't. So you've got to kind of make that call if you think it's going to be material or not. But if you do think it's material, then you've got to run a sensitivity across it to understand how it's going to impact.
I think I could probably add to that too, as part of our approach. This is not clear to us this is not our first grid blueprint, and that as part of this, there'll be knowns, unknowns, and risks. What will be important will be to try and do our best, as Andrew said, for scenarios that dealing with the shorter, medium-term unknowns as best we can. Because we'll be identifying the projects that economically, based on all the analysis, make sense to do, say in the next, 15, within the next 15 years time. These, not the next 30, that will be our focus of the sort of low regrets. You've got the opportunity when you come back again in say 3, 4 or 5 years time, those unknowns, which arguably most of them are further out into the future, will be more known, right? And it'll be appropriate to take another step forward out, from 15 years to 20 years of today, because you'll be that much closer. So that sort of look at below regrets, what's the pathway out to 2050, take a step along that pathway, also helps deal with it, while at the same time the pathway has been informed by taking views through scenarios on some of those unknowns.
Sure. So I guess what I'm hearing is that the grid blueprint won't be kind of a de facto commitment to specific projects, because that uncertainty is kind of built in, and actions wouldn't be taken until those things were much clearer, further in the future.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yes. No, that is clear, and that's a very good point. The blueprint is not a commitment to a transmission investment decision. That's not the purpose of the blueprint. It's to provide visibility and to be prepared for those decisions ahead of time.
Yeah, the normal process we have today, which is involved, we're using for our major capital projects, would apply. We would hope, given the work we're doing here is evidence-based, that where we do make a case that a slightly more, anticipatory approach to some investments is justified and is beneficial to New Zealand in an economic sense, that if that's not something that works well in the current regulatory framework, then we can have a discussion about that, and perhaps some of those framework settings need to change. Equally, if, for instance, they do need to build new lines, we'll have the arguments to help with resource planning and land access and things like that. So, this is very much a solid analytical piece of work to provide an evidence base for the discussions that we will need to have if we need to do significant transmission investment.
I've got a comment here that I'd like to ask you to respond to. Markets will adapt to whatever grid you have. This, I think, comes back to when we were talking about the market model before. If there's too much, it is too costly, or if there's not enough, some industries may leave or will not invest. The downside of transmission can be quite severe because it takes so long to build, the industry will generally not wait around. The person concurs with the nature and the magnitude of the challenge we're facing here, establishing this grid blueprint. Do you have a comment perhaps about the markets and the response?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Look, we are, these scenarios, put out an assumed view on demand, but also generation. But that generation is obviously market-led investment in generation. So we have no control over that. And if the grid is not there to support generation getting built in that region, then the market will not build generation in that region, right? So it doesn't. What they're saying is completely true, I think, and I think that's why it's important to identify those resource rich areas when we're putting together this grid blueprint, because it's really those, although we're not picking winners in the generation space, we can't do that, but we can understand where renewable resource is rich, which parts of the country have rich and valuable renewable resource, and we can unlock regions and things like that. So
or identify what could
yeah,
be done.
yes,
What's prudent, low regrets.
Low regrets investment. Yes, that's right. So it's yeah, it's about prioritizing those regions, and particularly the resource-rich regions.
And the modelling formula sort of says, well, if I look at the cost of the resources that are in that region, if the grid was unconstrained, and then the cost of investment to unconstrained, if that's still lower than having to build more expensive generation elsewhere, then adding transmission to the mix to unlock that region makes sense, right? And in the past, we've done that under the major capital programs, but it's tended to need a lot of evidence, whereas we're hoping here, with the maturity around our generation stack and our consultation, we can see a region that has the opportunity to provide, say, a lot of wind or something like that at a cost for a relatively modest transmission investment. Then we'll look to unlock that region.
Yeah.
The other probably architecture thing is, if we identify we need more capacity on the grid, say down the backbone, is it appropriate to route any new backbone line through a region that's resource rich to unlock it? So, we're in our minds, depending on what's needed, it's not necessarily, the long linear grid we have today. It might be more of a mesh network, which in itself offers opportunity to unlock more regions for generation.
Another question for you, John. Do you think that long-term planning should be entirely market-driven, or if some form of central planning should be brought in to help provide more optimal solutions?
I guess the approach we're taking here is, trying to secure through your collective support a mandate to create a grid blueprint, and we're doing that, through our engagements, through our consultation, through the conversations we've had up and down New Zealand. Some of them have been fantastic, so that there's a general buy-in to the fact that there are lots of futures for New Zealand. We could rely more on distributed generation. We could do lots of things, but to grow our economy, we need to, where it's appropriate and justified, upgrade our transmission grid. Right? That outright central planning hasn't always served New Zealand well either. So, that drawing on what people know rather than sort of living in a more central planned vacuum, we think offers some strengths. We are making sure what we produce here is evidence-based, so it can be used to make arguments with, or to support arguments with regulators and policymakers about where changes to settings are needed.
Talking about that regulatory kind of space, put a question about who carries the risk of any anticipatory investment.
Yeah, so we mentioned it earlier, that it's important to distinguish that the blueprint's not a transmission investment decision. So the blueprint's going to trigger internal working within Transpower around preparatory investigations, think of things like high-level design, consenting, landowner conversations, those sorts of things. Those represent a very small fraction of total investment cost on the project, but they set us up for the final investment decision. So, and those OPEX investigations, those are OPEX investigations. So Transpower and our shareholder carry the risk for that work. Yeah.
Oh, I guess also the key challenge there is transmission pricing. The model we have at the moment is very much about allocating the cost of new grid investment to the beneficiaries. And we acknowledge that if there's a case for more anticipatory investment to enable benefits to future beneficiaries, there may need to be a conversation about cost and who wears the risk. But what we want to do is make that point. We'll see if we can make that point, if it's a valid point to be made, and then have the conversation.
A very specific question here. Transpower seems averse to special protection schemes on the core grid, but they have been used in Australia, such as using batteries as virtual transmission lines. Are these under consideration as well as additional transmission?
Yes, they are under consideration, but they do have a shorter lead time associated with them. So implementing a special protection scheme is not something that we necessarily need, 12 years of visibility on, because it wouldn't take that amount of time to implement. So, so in our Te Kanapu documentation, and as we work towards a future grid blueprint, I'll concede that we probably won't talk a whole lot about special protection schemes, but maybe when we do get to final investment decision on things that special protection schemes can save us money, then they'll be on the table.
I think the question also opens up actually quite an exciting development that is happening in Australia and is on our minds, and that's the mention of batteries, right? So putting away the special protection scheme in its own right, yes, there's a growing awareness that the use of larger scale grid batteries can act as a way of supporting transmission investment, particularly in some urban areas where it's very hard to get routes for transmission lines, or where something is needed quite quickly as a staged pathway to a future investment. So in a light-hearted way, we do wonder if our future business might not just be transmission as we know it today, but also some involvement, whether through contracted or ownership of larger scale batteries. And we're certainly watching that development overseas, because it is an interesting take on things that you might not have thought about before. There is a lot for us, for those who aren't familiar, Australia is sort of ahead on this kind of journey. And when it comes to transmission investment, new lines, there is a lot we can and will learn from the approach and challenges that they've had.
I know batteries aren't necessarily new technology, but are there other new technologies that could solve some of the issues that we are considering as potentially needing, future transmission lines?
Yeah, definitely. So the way that we're sort of building it together in the technical approach, I suppose, is that we are looking primarily at sort of proven and mature, AC and DC transmission solutions to form part of our blueprint. But then sitting alongside that, we have a separate piece of work that's looking at, how are new technologies coming into the market, and what's their sort of technology readiness level, and how is that evolving? So things like, flexible AC transmission systems, power flow controllers, multi-terminal HVDC, HTLS conductors, these kinds of things that are sort of really interesting and cool pieces of kit, but would send our kind of analytics team into an absolute spin of like, whoa, too many things on the table here, people. So although our sort of core analysis is considering proven and mature transmission options, sitting alongside that is this kind of technology report that is sort of telling us, well, by the time you look at the need date of when this new line, say, is needed, and then you look at and you sort of line that up next to your technology report, and you say, well, in the mid 2030s, you might have some, your flexible AC transmission system equipment might be much more mature than it is now. your power flow controllers might be, you know, your phase shifting transformer, all this stuff might be something that you could consider down the line. Might be, but you know, like particularly if it's a lead time of 10 years and you need it in 9 years, just, you know, start the consenting, start the landowner conversations, don't sort of hold your breath and hope that a flexible AC transmission system will get you out of the loop later on. Does that kind of...
Yeah. And just for this audience, the biggest disruptor, if it can be made to happen, not one that was palatable in New Zealand context, is small modular nuclear. Right? A lot of research going into that, not just with OpenStar here in New Zealand, but all around the world. I guess the question I kind of ask us in New Zealand is, what advantage does that give us over the rest of the world? And that causes me to think a bit more about our potential generation resources. And, you know, nuclear is just a consistent supply of hot steam out of a reactor. Well, we've got a huge volcanic reactor in the middle of the North Island that can produce a constant supply of hot steam. And on two fronts, the existing resource, people say you could double the amount of generation with it. You know, it's an advantage we and only a few other countries have. And then we have a government-sponsored program to go for supercritical geothermal. So, you know, when I hear those sort of things, I think, well, those technologies are great, but they'll happen everywhere in the world. What are the resources we've got that would make us more attractive for us to produce goods and services that we can sell overseas and to our home market in a competitive way?
And maybe I can answer my own question here, but with such an uncertainty, obviously the grid blueprint will be for a moment in time.
Right.
That's going to be the view for now.
We will need to update this every 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
Yes, we will. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
And as those technologies perhaps mature or come to market
Yes.
or become, you know, economic.
That's right. Yes.
That changes.
Yes.
Picture.
We cannot just publish one grid blueprint and
That's the
job done.
15
Yeah.
years.
Yeah. We need to keep monitoring and refreshing this
Cool.
work. Yeah.
I have another question here. What are the expectations from power system modelling? Will high impact weather scenarios form part of the analysis?
Right. Yeah, good question. So, the power system modelling, I suppose, here's kind of how I think about it a little bit. The market modelling doesn't have as strong an understanding of the physics of how the power system works. And these models are incredibly rational, right? They're optimizing an objective function and trying to minimize that. And what that market model can do is just take you off into a range of parameter space, which when you look at it under the sort of laws of physics and engineering, you say you can't do that. You're breaching N-1 security on all these lines. You're doing things that you're running the system, you're running the power system in a way that we would never actually run it in reality. So the expectation from the power system modeling is to just basically keep that market model in check and doing things that make sure that the actual market model is operating the power system in a way that makes sense. Yeah, so that's the sort of expectation on the power system model. The high impact weather scenarios, I think maybe what that's referring to is like the high impact, low probability kind of things that can happen where a storm takes out a transmission line or something like that. So yes, the resilience side of things is part of the analysis. The kind of raw market modeling and power system modeling that gets done is assuming that you have this, you know, N-1 security constrained dispatch on the market, and it goes ahead and does its thing according to that. That's how the current market is run. And, you know, guess what? We still we occasionally get interruptions on the power network. Sometimes people go without power unexpectedly. So we know that N-1 doesn't mean no interruptions. So on top of that N-1 market modeling, we also kind of have a separate work stream that looks at reliability and resiliency. And as part of that, we're trying to understand, are there certain parts of the grid like Auckland or something which is just so big that it's actually you actually would justifiably put an N-2 security into the region. Yeah, or you want to. I mean, we're not getting into the level of establishing line routes in this work, but do you want a geographically diversified mix? I mean, sometimes you've got N-1 security into a region from an electrical perspective, but if the two circuits are on the same line from a geographical perspective, that you're so is it better off to sort of split those across two lines that are sort of geographically diverse? Yeah, so that's kind of part of it. Yeah.
And so that's part of the energy trilemma talking about before, right?
That's the reliability and reliability and security corner of it. Yeah.
Just touching on a point relevant to that, in our role as system operator and working with my colleague Chantel, the generation mixes that come out of this work in terms of what the grid might look for will also be really, really useful to us in our role as system operator to understand how you might, to Andrew's point, operate a power system. If economic modelling in that, albeit with the right constraints, has a very distributed system, there'll be sort of deeper questions around what does the inertia look like, what does the system strength look like, things like that. So I guess a part of this work will also be helpful for our role as system operator to be able to visualise the challenges they might face looking out to 2050 and useful for their strategy work that they're doing at the moment.
Any questions from anyone else? Or anything that either of you think has been missed that you'd like to explain or go over?
I think the other thing that may be of interest or will be of interest to people is, we did consult on our potential scenarios. I think we got over 100 or 120 responses, which is, talking to an Australian group, was amazing. And a lot of people liked the ambition we had for New Zealand to grow. As I said earlier, there's a reason why we're being ambitious. We'd rather know what the upside of what we might have to do rather than underscope it. There was some good feedback there too around areas that are more unknown, particularly sustainable aviation fuel and data centres. So when you see our summary of submissions on that consultation and the documentation on our scenarios and the next one coming out at the end of this month, you'll see that we've actually pulled back a bit. We've heard people, we've pulled back a bit on our assumptions around sustainable aviation fuel and data centres. We've gone looking for evidence. In the case of data centres, there's the New Zealand Tech report. In the case of sustainable aviation fuel, there seems to be a growing view that it's going to come from overseas. And even in Australia, they've dialed back their hydrogen production assumptions as well. So, it just sort of underscores the value to us of putting out a view, a position that's well researched out there, but then listening and, understanding what others think of that.
Yeah. So I think the next thing that's coming up for us is, oh no, we have one more question just come in. Have we looked at the MB study on New Zealand battery storage for dry year resilience?
Yes, I think we're aware of it. I think that's been a really solid foundation for understanding the dry year problem that New Zealand has and what are a range of potential solutions. Like obviously they were studying that pumped hydro storage thing and Onslow, and alongside that there was, if I understood, a portfolio option and then some sort of thermal option. Seems like it seems like, you know, we're kind of heading towards this LNG, you know, well, it seems like New Zealand's kind of taking this LNG route towards the dry year resilience. So that's, yes, in some ways it's kind of good to get that uncertainty resolved a little bit. But yeah, I think that MBIE study was really kind of, you know, dramatically advanced everyone's understanding of what was involved in that dry year resiliency and put some really good options out on the table.
And Andrew, you've got work to do to make, as part of our generation mix, to look at both energy and capacity adequacy, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That's part of our
work. Yeah, so in our scenarios, which we're publishing pretty soon, you know, John talked about the changes that we've made up to consultation 2, and the final versions are coming out later this month. And at each one of those scenarios, you know, there's, you know, it's explicit, you know, how does New Zealand meet the dry year reserve in this scenario? How does it meet peaks and things like that? Like they should be, scenarios should make sense from a range of views like that.
So I think that's the next time that you'll hear from us is when we publish our next consultation on called Future Direction, and that includes those finalised scenarios. So that's coming out later this month. If you're not already signed up for the email updates for our Te Kanapu work, we will add everyone who is present at this meeting to those so that you get that when we release it. Thank you very much for attending and sharing your questions with us. If you have further questions, you know, please email them through, and someone in the core team will get back to you.